Professor Kang, by way of brief bio, Professor Kang received her BA from Cornell University and holds an MA in Jurisprudence and Social Policy and a PhD in American History from Cal Berkeley. Go Bears. She previously taught at CSU San Marcos and is currently the Ann Stark and Chester Watson Associate Professor of History at the University of Texas at Dallas. She teaches a wide range of courses, including those on Western and Borderlands history, Asian American, Chicano, Chicana, Native American, immigration, and legal history. Joining us today are two highly distinguished professors I'm very grateful volunteered to serve as commentators, Professors Cristina Rodríguez and Anna Law. Professor Rodríguez is a Leighton Homer Surbeck Professor of Law here at the Yale Law School. A double grad of Yale College and Yale Law School, Professor Rodríguez also received a master's in history as a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford and has previously taught at NYU Law. From 2011 to 2013, she served as Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Office of Legal Counsel in the US Justice Department. She teaches and writes extensively in numerous fields such as immigration and citizenship law and policy, administrative law and process, and constitutional law and theory. Very recently, her co-authored book with Adam Cox, The President and Immigration Law, came out with Oxford University Press, and we're very excited here at the center to discuss that with her later at the turn of 2021. Professor Anna Law of Brooklyn College is an Associate Professor of Political Science, where she holds a Herbert Kurz Chair in Constitutional Rights. Professor Law received her BA from Brandeis, MA from Brown, and PhD from UT Austin. At Brooklyn College, she teaches courses ranging from immigration and refugee policy to numerous other fields. She is the author of many publications that explore law, politics, history, and political development, including her highly influential The Immigration Battle in American Courts, which examines the institutional evolution of the Supreme Court in relation to the US Court of Appeals in the domain of immigration policy. And I'm the final discussant. I come to Yale by way of McGill and also Cal Berkeley, where I got my PhD in history. I teach courses in US and Canadian immigration and citizenship history here, and I'm turning my dissertation into a book. Here's how we're organizing our discussion today. I'll turn the floor over to Professor Kang to introduce her book and talk about it at greater length. Then Professor Rodríguez, Professor Law, and I will offer brief comments about the book and its interventions in our respective fields. Return the floor to Professor Kang to offer responses, have a bit of crosstalk, and then open to general Q&A. The Q&A function is available here on the webcast below. So if you have a question and want to throw it up in the queue, please do so at any time, and we'll do our best to respond to as many as we can. Thank you all for being here. Professor Kang, we're thrilled to have you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Brendan, for that very, very generous and kind introduction. If I could mention, it's just wonderful seeing Brendan. I met Brendan when he was a graduate student at UC Berkeley. Go Bears. And it's just been wonderful and delightful to watch Brendan grow and develop in this profession. And I'm very honored that he invited me to be a part of this series at the Macmillan Center. I also want to thank Brendan and Hira for organizing this event, not just once, but twice. They organized this event for our pre-COVID times, but the event was canceled. And so they had to do all the work a second time for today. So I recognize how much time and effort this takes. So I'm tremendously grateful to Brendan and Hira. I'd also like to thank Cristina Rodríguez and Anna Law and Brendan Shanahan for sharing their time and expertise with us this afternoon. I know that COVID has placed extra pressures on all of us. So I recognize that there are sacrifices made to prepare comments for this afternoon's panel. So thank you again for your time and expertise. So if you'll give me a moment, I'm going to share my screen. Can everyone see the PowerPoint? Great. So I was told not to start with a reference to a film, but I'm going to start with a reference to a film. As a young adult, one of my favorite movies was All the President's Men. I especially appreciated a short scene in which the camera pans over Washington's monumental buildings, which are draped in a gloomy gray pallor thanks to the sunless sky above. For me, the scene lent an air of mystery and drama to the workings of the American state. And my curious teenage self wondered, what actually happens inside those big buildings in Washington, D.C.? What actually happens inside the state? Many years later, as a graduate student in the early aughts, I found myself asking a variation of this question with respect to the INS. At the time, histories of the agency along the US-Mexico border tended to offer pluralist or society-centered accounts rather than institutional ones. Thus, I began the process of trying to figure out what takes place within the INS on a daily basis. Yet I discovered more than I expected in the archives, specifically extensive accounts of the central role played by Southwestern immigration officials in defining the nation's immigration laws. As I'll explain in the next 10 minutes, these findings led me to challenge scholarly and popular conceptions of the INS as a law enforcement agency and shift our attention to the many ways that the INS made and remade the nation's immigration laws. In the early stages of my research, I conceived of the INS as an enforcement agency and planned to write about immigration federalism. Coursework on American legal history and conflicts that emerged in the 1990s between the states and the federal government with respect to immigration law enforcement led me to propose a PhD dissertation that would trace the role of state and local law enforcement agencies in the work of federal immigration law enforcement. Yet, as the historians in the room well know, the archives almost always lay waste to the painstakingly wrought plans of graduate students. Thus, in the first 2 weeks of a preliminary research trip to the National Archives, I realized that I would not find evidence regarding immigration federalism in Record Group 85, the records of the Immigration and Naturalization Service. Exhuming a story of federal-state cooperation in immigration law enforcement would require trips to multiple state archives and a perusal of other federal agency records, as Sibel Fox's masterful book, Three Worlds of Welfare Relief, would subsequently illustrate. Yet while Record Group 85 failed to offer much evidence regarding the coordination between local, state, and federal officials with respect to border policing, it did yield enormous amounts of data regarding the relationship between local, regional, and central offices of the INS. As I followed the instructions of my dissertation chair and collected information on the major turning points in immigration policy history along the US-Mexico border, these included the Immigration Act of 1917, the Immigration Act of 1924, the so-called repatriation drives of the 1930s, the Bracero program, and Operation Wetback. So as I collected data on these moments, several clear trends emerged. These included a lack of consensus between local, regional, and central offices, and the regular and sweeping exercise of administrative discretion by immigration inspectors and Border Patrol officers in the Southwest. These officials' exercise of discretion was so extensive that I often reacted to the agency documents with the thought, you guys are just making this up as you go along. Just as striking, time and again, INS leaders stationed in the Southwest successfully formalized numerous ad hoc and discretionary practices by incorporating them into the agency's regulations, lobbying Congress for their integration into the federal statutes, or participating in the legislative drafting process. In short, immigration officials along the border were doing more than implementing the nation's immigration laws. They were also making and remaking them. My archival research then served served as the basis for my main argument in the INS on the Line, that the INS functioned not only as a law enforcement agency, but also as a lawmaking body. As I further explain, these lawmaking endeavors provided local agency officials with the means to endure the numerous challenges surrounding immigration law enforcement on the US-Mexico border. These included a lack of support, particularly in the form of appropriations, from policymakers in Washington, D.C., who long considered the INS the backwater of the American administrative state. Other challenges included internal agency conflicts, tremendous opposition from border residents, including Asian, European, Mexican, and American nationals, seen here in these photos on my PowerPoint presentation. And then other challenges also included the seemingly unachievable task of policing the rugged terrain of the 2,000-mile international boundary. In the face of these obstacles, Southwestern agency officials resorted to the law by regularly exercising their administrative discretion, helping to draft new laws and policies for the border region, and ensuring that what were once ad hoc practices became the law of the land. Thus, for example, local immigration officials used their administrative discretion to suspend various restrictions under the Immigration Act of 1917 and created a border crossing card program, a program that allowed tens of thousands of temporary visitors, including consumers, entertainers, students, tourists, and more, to cross and recross the border on a daily basis. After Border Patrol officers openly admitted that their practice of stopping vehicles without warrant on roads within 100 miles of the border was of dubious legality, Border Patrol leaders in the Southwest helped to draft legislation that would legalize this practice and created what became known as the 100-mile zone. And by the late 20th century, it came to be known as the Constitution-free zone. As legal scholars and law professors in the room know, this term Constitution-free zone is misleading because the Constitution still continues to apply there and everywhere in the country. The agency's resort to these legal innovations was so extensive that in the early 1920s, one local immigration leader observed that a quote unquote sectional immigration policy existed in the borderlands. Yet despite their ad hoc and local origins, these lawmaking endeavors served as the building blocks of the administrative state in the border region. And this is the third component of my book's argument. The INS on the Line makes several contributions to immigration, Western, and borderlands histories. First, it departs from the notion that Congress and the courts make the laws that administrative agencies dutifully implement. Instead, it stresses the active and wide-ranging role played by an administrative agency, the INS, in the lawmaking process. Second, it raises questions about the development of the American administrative state. While expertise, rational decision-making, and neat organizational designs are said to have informed the shaping of the American administrative state, in the immigration policy context, sheer incompetence, conflicts among and between social, political, and institutional actors, and a highly disorganized administrative agency served as the foundations of the state in the Southwest. Third, the book transforms our view of the border. Whereas borderlands historians have written rich accounts of how Native peoples, European empires, and nation states from the 15th century to the present have conceptualized borders in North America, my own work explains how immigration officials generated multiple and even competing legal constructions of the border. Construed in broad terms, the legal innovations of the INS rendered the border a geopolitical dividing line, a binational socioeconomic zone, and a policing jurisdiction in which immigration officials could undertake what we today refer to as interior enforcement. Finally, the book bears relevance for us today, given the over 400 changes made to the nation's immigration system by the Trump administration, and given that many of those changes were made through regulations and policies issued at the agency level, the INS on the Line provides historical context for the ongoing and formidable role played by administrative agencies in the transformation of the law. During the Q&A, I'm happy to discuss the lessons learned from the researching and writing of the INS on the Line and how I'm trying to apply those lessons as I write my second book, A History of Immigration Legalization in the United States. And I'd also welcome any feedback that you have on the book and any specific thoughts on the interdisciplinary approach of the book, especially since I'm taking a similar interdisciplinary approach in my second book. As an interdisciplinary scholar, it goes without saying that I'm delighted by the multidisciplinary composition of this panel, and I look forward to learning much from Cristina, Anna, and Brendan this afternoon. So without further ado, I'll hand off the baton to Cristina.
Thank you so much, Brendan, for convening us. It really is a distinct pleasure and honor for me to get to talk about Debbie's book with Debbie. I know her work, I knew her work before I met her, and I've learned from and relied heavily on this book and my own work on immigration enforcement. Her name is dotted throughout the endnotes that of the book that Brendan mentioned. And she really makes a major contribution to understanding the centrality of enforcement and enforcement agencies to the way in which immigration law and policy develop as a matter of substance. And she demonstrates in really painstaking and vivid detail how bureaucratic development and administrative implementation, the physical reality of the bureaucracy, shapes our legal regime, and how bureaucracies and the discretionary decisions that they make create the actual domain of the law, which consists of far more than the parameters drawn in statutes. And in that sense, this work is an important contribution to legal theory in addition to history. The book for me is also a reminder that I think is helpful and indeed urgent to make in this time when immigration and immigration enforcement are on the front pages, that the borderlands are not a transit zone. The border is not a line. It's a populated physical environment where people carry on their daily affairs and where institutions operate to try to regulate them. So the fortification of the border has actually been constituted by an interplay between coercion and resistance, the former being ameliorated through the forms of administrative discretion that Debbie brings to light. And she also demonstrates how in the borderlands, both the subnational and the supranational contribute to policy formation. And definitely showing that intertwinement is a crucial contribution that's really made vivid throughout the book. Finally, she reconceptualizes the border not as porous, as some political critiques might suggest, but rather as regulated and managed. It's neither fortified nor open. It has hard edges, to be sure, but that's reflective less of fortification than of an interest in social control. So much more complex than the simplistic narratives that surround things like support for the wall suggest. And she presents a picture of border enforcement as not always about exclusion or restriction, but of regulation of non-immigrant border crossers and the facilitation of commerce with simultaneous efforts to keep immigration status contingent. All of these speak to contemporary debates in politics and law. And what I want to do with the time that I have to talk about this is highlight what I think are 3 or 4 major contributions to the way that lawyers and legal scholars might think about immigration law and policy that come from this book and reinforce the interdisciplinarity and the importance of it that Debbie's highlighted. The first is that she really helps us to see the INS, and then by extension, the Department of Homeland Security and Customs and Border Protection, as a bureaucracy, not as simply a collection of law enforcement officials or militarized agents, but as a bureaucracy. And she does that by really effectively demolishing two conventional wisdoms about the border, which are inconsistent with one another, and therefore demonstrate the need for her different story. The first, the view that the INS has always been and remains in the form of the Border Patrol within DHS ineffectual, and has allowed in illegal immigration through feckless enforcement. And the second is the view that the INS and the Border Patrol, DHS, are strong and highly aggressive as an agency. What she demonstrates is a nuanced view of law enforcement. And she describes it as law enforcement actually consisting of lawmaking as well. And the way I would describe it is enforcement itself necessitating value judgments and policy judgments, both at a principled level, but also at a pragmatic level. And the way in which the INS uses its administrative discretion, a feature of the modern administrative state on the borderlands, to simultaneously enhance and diminish the exclusionary aspects of immigration law. I think the story in chapter 2 of the rise of the Border Patrol in particular is effective in this regard, and it shows the Border Patrol as a bureaucracy searching for ways to both realize and expand its power. I was struck by a comment by a border official early in the days of the Border Patrol in 1924-25, that at the outset, no one knew what we were supposed to do or how we were supposed to do it, which is not ordinarily how we think about agents of the administrative state. Without badges, with old-fashioned weapons, these people who didn't know what they were supposed to do figured out what to do, and as Debbie shows, in the process helped to make the law through their use of increased overtime state capacity. And in reading this account in chapter 2, I can't help but think, and I wonder what Debbie thinks about this, that part of what gave rise to this use of discretion to really construct the law was this culture of manly adventure, this sense of adventure that characterized the early Border Patrol, kind of masculinized understanding of what in fact they were supposed to be doing at the border, which I think carries through to the way popular culture and agents themselves conceptualize border enforcement. Chapter 4's account of the Bracero program also beautifully highlights this notion of the INS as a bureaucracy in the sense of the modern administrative state, not just enforcing the law, but actually making the law. And through the pursuit of its own particular interest during that period, the INS helps to shape the Bracero program and also monitors and manages the unauthorized immigration that grows up around it. The second kind of contribution, or the second set of ideas that this work really suggests to a legal scholar, people interested in legal institutions, is the importance of the relationship between political leadership and the bureaucracy. So the story is not just about the agents in the field. It is about the interplay between the local and the national in the context of the administrative state, the line agents and political officials, whether at the regional level or in Washington itself. At one point in the book, Debbie characterizes those agency leaders as symbolic and the line officials better positioned to define INS policies. And that, in a sense, flips the standard understanding on its head, that it's the people in the field, the diffused bureaucracy, and not the political principles in Washington or at the district level that are making the decisions. But in showing that, or in making that kind of a claim, Debbie underscores how complex and challenging the task of centralization is. And that drive towards centralization of bureaucratic authority is one that you see in many domains throughout the course of the 20th century, but it's really defined our present moment in immigration enforcement. And the way she demonstrates how leaders in the INS participated in policymaking, but yet INS officials who themselves were shielded from elections and had decades of experience with daily operations were in the position to define long-term policies is really instructive, not just for understanding the way bureaucracies work, but also for political officials who have an interest in shaping policy when they come into office, something of concern to whoever might take over the Department of Homeland Security. And yet we also see in her work the need for centralized supervision. It's not enough to say that the agents in the field, through their comparative advantage of their position within the bureaucracy, shape the law. They're also limited in the way in which they do that. And the discussion of the 1930s and Depression era deportation campaigns really highlights how sometimes diffused authority, especially in a law enforcement bureaucracy, can become abusive, and how legal reformers and high up officials within an agency might be prompted to try to clean up an inhumane record. And in the 1930s, the imposition from above of rules, expectations of professionalism, the requirement of a warrant authority for officials to make arrests on the border, and the turn away from a blind commitment to deportation to an understanding of deportation that considers the equities that might be involved in the decision whether to deport is an incredibly important move that required at least an attempt at centralization. And Debbie connects it directly to movements in legal theory towards a more sociological conception of the law during the advent of what we call legal realism, and demonstrating how the interplay within an actual bureaucracy helped to push that set of ideas forward is extremely helpful and illuminating. I get the sense from the work, and at one point Debbie actually explicitly says that some of these reform efforts were failures. And yet it's the struggle itself highlights a tension that persists in our law today between what high-level supervision might accomplish, particularly as it softens the rough edges of law enforcement bureaucracy, and how high-level officials will always have to deal with the, in some sense, superior institutional and practical knowledge of line agents. The third point I want to make, and I'll keep this short because there's a lot to be said about this one in particular, and in many ways this is the way the book spoke to me the most loudly, was the story that it tells of administrative improvisation, of the way in which administrative actors, the agents who she talks about, depart from federal laws and reconstruct them, develop mechanisms using small bureaucratic authorities or invent bureaucratic authorities through interpretations of the law or through just assertion of will to make it possible to do their job. And so much of the book is a fascinating story of officials at the border creating exceptions to the law to facilitate trade and commerce and travel through literacy test waivers and the wartime agricultural labor program, border crossing cards like the one that she showed a photo of. And what's interesting about these developments is not just how bureaucratic officials adapt and make use of the authorities they have and create their own, but it's how they are responsive to localized demands, to the needs of merchants and residents in the borderlands, and how their experience also can lead to reform within the system as a whole. So how the call for a roving border patrol came in part from immigration inspectors who were frustrated by the variegated demands of enforcement, a story she tells in chapter 1. And so throughout the 20th century, you see agency officials facilitating the entry of visitors and dignitaries and farm workers and actively spurring economic development, and searching for and developing alternatives to, in some cases, deportation, which was costly and cumbersome, developing frameworks that are now part of our law, voluntary departure, the repatriation program that she talks about. And ultimately, for someone who's interested in administrative law and the administrative state, what this work highlights is how the persistent dynamism of administrative institutions can lead to innovations, and ultimately how they shape congressional action. This is a story that I've told in some of my work, and Debbie tells it extremely effectively here, how the bureaucracy actually helps to shape the formal law, and Congress is pressured by what they do to act. For example, by expanding the Border Patrol's formal legal authority, by expanding the border zone in the 1940s. So I'll leave the comments or hand it over to Anna by saying that all of these phenomena together suggest how a work of history of this kind can actually help us better understand our contemporary legal institutions, and how through enforcement discretion and the exercise of discretion, which again is a persistent feature of the administrative state, forms of law get made. This idea of policymaking through enforcement is actually, it's a pervasive phenomenon across fields, but it's really central in immigration law and in immigration history. And I think she succeeds in her ambition of demonstrating how institutions and the way they're actually working in practice are just like other sociocultural phenomena, constructing the borderlands, defining what they are, and defining how people live within them. And for that work, I'm enormously grateful. So now I'll hand it over to Anna for her observations.
Okay. Hey, thank you, everyone. Thank you to the Macmillan Center and Yale for inviting me to do this. I'm trying to, hang on, give me a second here to get my screen up. Okay, people, you guys are in big trouble, because when political scientists do PowerPoint, it is not even half as interesting as a historian. We got no pictures, and typically we do a 50-point deck at 3-point font. Lucky for you, this is the only slide. So how do I, what is so great about this book? Let me count 3 ways. So I am constantly telling journalists and other non-immigration people that we have a really warped and distorted view of immigration policy because of Trump. Because of Trump, we think that everything immigration policy is restrictionist. No. Immigration is multifaceted. And what Professor Kang's book does really well is it illustrates immigration policy cannot just be about keeping people out. Because of economic considerations and geopolitical considerations, you have to also let people in. So one of the great things this book does is underscore a well-run immigration policy is not one that keeps everyone out. A well-run immigration policy keeps the people who are not supposed to come in out, and lets the people who are supposed to come in. And this book does a really nuanced job of the bureaucracy trying to figure out, okay, how do we do that? And basically with labor, they've decided to approach it as the water faucet. We need labor, turn the faucet on. We don't want labor, okay, turn it off, deport them. And so immigration policy is always this dual thing where it's not only enforcement or restriction. The second thing is Professor Kang's book does a really good job explaining. So I've talked to people who don't study immigration law, or, I know a lot of other political scientists who study constitutional law. And I said, no, see, immigration law is the Bermuda Triangle of constitutional law, where the 4th Amendment and the 14th Amendment, okay, unreasonable search and seizure and equal protection law, that's where it goes to immigration law to die. That's the Bermuda Triangle where all those, amendments that apply to other areas of law, like criminal law, they somehow disappear. So Professor Kang's book explains, okay, so in that 100-mile zone where con law doesn't apply, how is it? How did it come to be that the Border Patrol can search persons and can stop people and racial profile them, And how can they go onto private property and cut people's locks and go onto private property to go searching for undocumented immigrants? So this is a pretty good account at the Bermuda Triangle aspect of immigration, where, you know, along a geographical zone, parts of the Constitution fail to apply when it pertains to immigration, even though it pertains to other areas of law in that same geographical zone. The third contribution that I think this book makes is that it details state building. And the story here that Professor Kang tells is, you know, this small, sleepy agency where it started out the bureaucratic side. If you look at the archives like she did, where there's memo after memo about the misfits. You know, you put the misfits in this agency. I mean, these people that can't cut it in other federal agencies, you stick them there. How did that become the agency? One of the quotes at the end of the book really blew my mind, that the US today spends more on immigration and border enforcement in terms of budget. That's more than the combined budget of the FBI, ATF, DEA, Secret Service, US Marshals, and the entire budget of the NYPD. What happened? Well, this book tells you how that sleepy agency, where the original Border Patrol agents, they didn't even have a car. They were trying to figure out, as they were like, oh, what are we supposed to be doing with our job? Oh, how do we do it? We don't have a car. Hey, this agency is now heavily armed, high-tech surveillance gear, drones, helicopters, Humvees. So this book explains how immigration drives state building and state capacity. Okay, so as I was reading this book, I thought of two political science concepts that the findings sort of very beautifully illustrate. So Karen Oren and Stephen Skoranek are American political development scholars in political science, and they have they've coined a term called intercurrents, and it's basically intercurrents means there's these agencies, these federal agencies or state agencies, which seem to be crazy quilts. They have missions and functions that conflict with each other, and one hand is doing one thing and the other side of the same agency is doing something else. I call the immigration agencies Frankenstein, but an illustration of intercurrents is found in Professor Kang's book. You've got parts of agencies that are created at a certain political moment to deal with a certain political or economic situation in time. And then you have another thing that arises, which creates another part of an agency mission and function. And so you've got all of these conflicting, so intercurrence is basically the idea that there's no grand design. Nobody sat down and said, let us design an immigration regulation agency that would best meet the needs of the United States regulating immigration. No such grand design. It's just this haphazard temporal sort of creations along the way. The second political science author I thought of when reading this book was John Kingdon, and he's a public policy guy. And he writes about policy entrepreneurs and policy windows. These are individuals in government. They could be in government. They could be in think tanks. And basically they kind of hanging out, and they've got ideas, big ideas about what to do with federal agencies and funding. And they're waiting for a political moment where it's possible. And they're very, they're very entrepreneurial. They are driving the policy because they're politically savvy, and they know, okay, now is the time to make the argument about expanded resources for our agency, not during this other time. And so when I read this book, so Grover C. Wilmoth and Joseph Swing, described in detail in this book, leading leaders of the Border Patrol, the textbook definition of policy entrepreneurs as described by Kingdon. And so I'm intercurrent, things like intercurrents and policy entrepreneurs, if you try to teach this to political science graduate students, admittedly, fog and glaze, too abstract, too obscure. I'm just going to point them to this book and say, okay, pick out the policy entrepreneurs in this book. You want an example of intercurrents? Okay, here you go. How do we get this Frankenstein agency, now known as DHS? I mean, remember when the rock star Prince, he changed his name to a symbol? So we had to call him the artist formerly known as Prince. This is now the agency formerly known as INS, which is this intercurrent agency which has functions that don't even match up with each other. Okay, so finally, let me wrap up with what struck me about a book by a historian is how much it spoke to the present moment. And you see Customs and Border Patrol, ICE, and DHS today, and you understand why Trump uses them as the shock troops to go into Portland, Oregon, and to kidnap protesters. You understand why ICE is beating the crap out of people from Cameroon trying to apply for asylum and literally putting a knee on their neck to force them to sign their own deportation orders. And Trump didn't call DEA, ATF, FBI to do his dirty work. He called these Customs and Border Patrol and ICE. And when you read Debbie's book, you're like, oh yes, I see why. Because of the culture, because of the thought of these agencies that we're somehow well, we don't have to abide with those procedural niceties because we're dealing with immigrants. So that's the the approach. And Peter Shook, who taught at Yale for many years, has often described immigration law as the nadir of individual rights and the zenith of government power. And studying immigration law, you kind of understand that when you read legal cases, but then you see the history of the Border Patrol as Debbie describes it, and you realize, okay, this is why. Because they've been given exception after exception after exception to actually applying laws. And they've been given broad discretion to make policy. So it's not a big wonder that they think the government has all the rights and immigrants have no rights. So let me wrap up there. I don't want to eat into Brendan's time, but I loved this book and it was great.
Thank you so much, Anna. Right, let me just reorganize the screen here. Okay, thank you very much, everyone. My remarks are going to build on many of those made by Cristina and Anna. And to distinguish them a little bit, I'm going to be focusing on Professor Kang's methodological and source-based approaches to discuss how her book operates as an example of policy history, and in turn argue that those interventions force us, who are immigration historians, to rethink how we conceptualize the theoretical and physical boundaries of that field of inquiry, particularly through the lens of borderland studies. Now, I don't know how many of you out there might have access to a physical copy of Debbie's book, but I'd invite you to turn to page 181, which is where the endnotes begin. and continue for nearly 70 pages in rather small, though legible font, to often containing detailed commentary, additional supplementary information, clarification about the information that Debbie has discovered in the archives and analyzed in very crisp prose in the main text. I mentioned these at the outset to highlight a couple factors. The first is to underscore the tremendous empirical archival excavation that Debbie has undertaken in her research and then made sense of and put into conversation with broader scholarly developments in this really tightly and well written book. And just to thank and recognize Debbie for that work. I have examined a few of those INS files myself in my own research. And while federal archivists have done their utmost to improve cataloging, adding finding aids to make sense of these collections, they remain in many ways a Pandora's box for would-be scholars. They're particularly scattered, even as federal records go. Hard to follow correspondence from file to file, box to box, and many of the documents have been physically worn down over the years. Debbie supplements her own primary source research with the findings of other scholars and is a generous scholar in citing their work, and follows different leads where they take her in additional published reports, testimony, and additional local archives. And I'm certain that many future scholars are going to be using these 70-ish pages of endnotes as a jumping off point for their future research. And it is this that I think makes for great policy history at its best. 20 years ago, historian Julian Zelizer argued in a widely read treatise that policy history represents an eclectic field of study, which at its most fundamental level, quote, unites those who organize their analyses and narrative around the emergence, passage, and implementation of policy, unquote. Zelizer goes on to describe policy history as a highly interdisciplinary field of scholarship that often emphasizes empirical discovery with an eye not just to academic audiences, but those currently engaged in the policy-making process. And it goes without saying that this is precisely what the INS on the line is engaged in. But I also think it destabilizes the categories that Professor Zelizer proposes as central units of analysis, the distinction between emergence, passage, and implementation of public policy. Allow me to explain. Most policy historians would probably approach this subject by foremost asking how or why a particular set of immigration restriction measures emerged, were adopted, and were implemented over a period of time. And indeed, that is what this book is doing. We learn a great deal, for instance, about how and why the INS as an agency is emerging in the progressive era and continues in the New Deal eras as a powerful institution filled with credentialed experts as a site of law enforcement and legal adaptation, in conjunction with many other agencies in the rise of the administrative state, while developing even further autonomy than most other branches. But Debbie also distinguishes her work by making the case that where, the category of where, should be equally considered as a central category of analysis when we study the evolution of policy. And in this way, seemingly exceptional examples of policy and how the way policy is adopted, adapted in practice that might have otherwise gotten a footnote in a book or been ignored in other analyses. For instance, the way in which the literacy test is made real or waived at the border itself totally reframes how we think about this broader subject of the literacy test debates of the progressive era and its adoption in the World War I era. And while several other historians have described the development of farm worker migration programs in the World War I era as a precursor to the larger Bracero program of the World War II era, Debbie's work demonstrates how this program was imagined, made possible, and executed in practice, quite literally on the fly. Yes, as other scholars have emphasized, Southern agribusinesses lobbied legislatures for it, and key Washington lawmakers supported this program. But it was the INS officers tasked with administering broader federal immigration law that adopted and adapted the actual documents or waived statutory requirements that enabled this farm worker migration pattern and process to happen. And then Professor Kang shows how, in her words, the local was made national as many of these ad hoc policies first emerging along the border become federal legislation or national administrative practices adopted by the INS central office and the top tier of administrators in Washington, D.C. A question that this line of inquiry I really want to pose to Debbie is just many times in your book, we see regional, district, INS, or Border Patrol leaders who are eager to create and assert power in the realm of policymaking. And at other times, particularly in your chapter on the early years of the Bracero program, INS leaders, sometimes the very same people who earlier wanted that power, are eagerly trying to say, I don't want, please don't put this in my portfolio. Is there a rule of thumb that helps explain the circumstances, the conditions, the types of policies that lead these leaders to either want to assert unilateral, de facto, or de jure policymaking power, or to say that's for someone else, often pointing the finger at Washington in the times when they're saying that's not my role. Now, to enable this pursuit of this question of where in policymaking, Professor Kang turns to the fields of borderland studies. Rather than seeing the US-Mexico border solely as a physical and literal line on a map, clearly delineating claims of national sovereignty, she joins in a long line of historians who have interrogated how that line has been marked, governed, crossed, and contested, and by whom, and put that physical border into a far broader borderlands, society, and economy. One aspect of this study that I really hope that immigration historians writ large will take from it is her keen focus on the numerous ways in which border crossers who were not defined as nor self-identified as permanent resident, those seeking permanent residence, just flummox the entire immigration law as it is adopted and constituted and imagined by lawmakers and INS central office administrators in DC. If the normative immigrant in the eyes of federal immigration law in the late 19 teens or the 1920s was someone seeking to enter, usually at a maritime port, to become a permanent resident in an increasingly restrictive regime of national origins and quota laws, Debbie shows how that was not the norm at the border itself. There, neighboring residents, merchants, tourists represent a disproportionately large number of would-be border crossers. Why is that so important? Well, while some immigration historians have explored the topic of temporary migration or immigrants who are portrayed as temporary migrants, such as Italian construction workers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries being juxtaposed with other contemporaneous immigrants as so-called birds of passage. Regular border crossers, either for tourist reasons, for reasons of commuting from neighboring towns, have received far, far less attention in this broader field of immigration history. But the INS on the line demonstrates the centrality of regular border crossers in the borderlands to the daily activities of INS and Border Patrol officers, and to the policies that they would then adopt and adapt to, such as those literacy test waivers, passport exemptions, and regimes of local resident identification, all often beginning on an ad hoc policy and increasingly becoming more routinized over time. We also see this, as Anna and Cristina have talked about, expanding in the realm of law enforcement claims and claims of a jurisdiction what we today would call interior enforcement, and increasingly coercive forms at that. As someone who studies the U.S.-Canadian history, I'd like to pose a bit of a comparative question on the table, which is the INS on the line and the patterns of policy adaptation and adoption in the early to mid 20th century at the US-Mexico border, are they representative of socioeconomic borderlands writ large, or specific to this borderlands and or this time at that borderlands? I don't think it's hard to imagine, at least in our pre-COVID times, for us who are participating, to imagine these types of adaptations being emerging along the US-Canadian border for tourists, for commuters from Windsor, Ontario to Detroit, Michigan, and vice versa. However, I think it's far more difficult to imagine these types of coercive regimes of Border Patrol operations through interior enforcement, extrajudicial activities and abuses along the northern border. But that was something that I wanted to raise for our conversation time period. We're at just over the hour mark, so Debbie, you've had a lot thrown at you. So why don't I turn the floor over to you, and then if you'd like to respond to some of the comments we raised, and we can have a bit of crosstalk, and then to all the members out there watching, please post some questions for us, put it in the queue, and we'd love to have a further conversation with you.
So can everyone hear me?
Mhm.
Okay, so thank you all for those comments, and they're extremely helpful. The references to the other theories and works of scholars in your respective fields will be extremely useful to me as I continue to study the history of American immigration law and its relationship to the construction of the American administrative state. So I'll begin with some of Brendan's methodological points and provide some explanation as to why the footnotes are so long. So the footnotes are so long for several reasons. When I was in graduate school, one of my professors made this backhanded compliment and said to me, "You footnote like a law school student." I think this is because I had spent some time in JSP, and I had been on the Berkeley Women's Law Journal and the Asian Law Journal, and had learned to, and actually frankly appreciate the way that law professors and legal scholars footnote. And I very much liked the discursive footnotes that they use. I like that legal scholars define their terms. So that was one reason, just my background. Another reason is that, several books had been written on the INS. You have Erica Lee's book on Angel Island. Kelly Lytle Hernandez was working on finishing up the dissertation that would become MIGRA as I was starting work on this project. So because I knew that there were other works out there, I felt like it was important to kind of use the footnotes to show where I was coming from and from where I was deriving my arguments. Another reason is that and I think this is the most important reason, given the state of Record Group 85, especially for those of you who haven't worked with Record Group 85, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that Record Group 85 is the least organized record group of all the administrative agency record groups at the National Archives. So by way of contrast, if you're looking at Record Group 59, everything in Record Group 59, these are the State Department records, everything is organized. The indexes make sense. The indexes to Record Group 59 make sense. They're organized by division within the State Department, and then by theme, and then by chronology. And you're pretty much guaranteed that when you ask for a document, when you ask the archivist for a document from Record Group 59, you are going to get it. That is not how 85 works. 85, it's pretty much the exact opposite. There are now multiple sets of indices to record group 85. There is no guarantee that any single one of them corresponds to what's actually in the National Archives. It's also the case that when you ask for a document from these multiple indices, and you have to look at all of them, and they're not, they don't cover discrete points or moments in INS history. They're oftentimes overlapping, frankly. So you have to look at, say, if you want to study the Border Patrol in 1924, you actually have to look at multiple indices to try to make sure that you get all the information that you need. And then when you do request a document from any single one of those indices, there's no guarantee that you'll get it. Another problem is that sometimes you'll request a document one year, say, in 2001, I requested a document. I go back to the archives in 2008 to do follow-up. I'll request that document again, it will be missing. That is common. That is very common. Documents with this record group tend to get lost, misfiled. And then we also know that huge chunks of record group 85 were likely destroyed. And this is why I actually think that there is a story about immigration federalism, specifically with respect to the cooperation of county sheriffs, city police, and the INS. But I am betting that those records were destroyed. I'm sure that they once existed, but they've probably been destroyed. So I think, so because of the state of record group 85, the footnotes, I footnoted extensively because I want to signal to other scholars, follow up, right? There are so many more stories about this bureaucracy that need to be told. And because it's so hard to get at them, I put the footnotes there. And, I've actually been talking to a law professor, Ingrid Eagley, a lot, because she's been working on a historical project, and she actually found me through the footnotes. She was reading my footnotes, and based on some of those footnotes, is looking for documents on her next project. And her next project is trying to flesh out the exact parameters of that Act of March 4, 1929 that criminalized undocumented entry. So she's trying to tell a fuller story of the implementation of that act by prosecutors on the ground in the Southwest. So that's exactly the kind of thing that I'd like to see happen, by way of these footnotes. That's why they're there. So when it comes to Brendan's points about the interdisciplinary nature of the book, maybe I should just expand on that by sharing a story. I think from the start of this project, there was always a tension as to whether it was going to be an immigration policy project or a Western history borderlands project. And that tension emerged because John Jurdy, an immigration historian, was the chair, and Kerwin Klein, a Western historian, was the second reader. And when I finished the dissertation prospectus, it was a proposal about immigration federalism. And all the literature was, law review articles, political science articles, political history articles. Kerwin Klein, the Western historian, read it. And when I went to meet with him about the prospectus, the first thing he said to me was, you need to take a road trip. You need to see the border. And of course, I was actually upset because I had worked on this prospectus for months and lost a lot of sleep. And here is this, high-powered faculty member at Berkeley telling me, go on a road trip. But his point was that I was missing something in telling this very Washington-centered story. And I was forgetting to think about kind of the impacts of these policies, these federal policies on local actors and institutions. And so I actually followed his advice, and I ended up visiting a lot of the border towns that I write about in the book. And then reading work in Borderlands history. And then the second pivotal moment came when I had a postdoc at the Clement Center for Southwest Studies, and that postdoc gives the visiting scholars an opportunity to have a manuscript workshop, and we're allowed to select faculty members to read and comment on our manuscripts. So I selected David Gutierrez, an immigration historian, and Brian Ballo, a political historian. And I half expected sparks to fly, but they didn't. And David and Brian came to a meeting of the minds when David told me, because at that time the dissertation, it was still very Washington-centered. David said to me, you need to reverse the chain of causation. You need to stop, you need to let the borderlands, the society and economy of the borderlands drive the machine, drive the chain of causation. And David found it very troubling that I kept casting the borderlands as kind of exceptional or aberrational. And he really stressed it's not aberrational, it's central, right? It's the main cause of what's happening here, right? And you really want to get away from this core periphery model. And I think, like, to this very day, I think David's words ring truer than ever before when we see the intense focus on the US-Mexico border. As you all know, immigration law and policy, it's not just about the US-Mexico border. There are a lot of other places and things that are getting regulated by our immigration laws and policies. But over the past half century or so, that site, that locale has been the central focus of our immigration agencies and immigration law. And you could argue that it's really driving the rest of the machine here. So those two experiences really pushed me to do more than to really get out of my comfort zone and to write something beyond a strictly policy history or strictly immigration history. So if I turn to Anna's comments, again, I love your references to the work of these other political scientists and policy historians. And I especially appreciated it because when I was writing this book, I was trying to figure out what was going on my own. And I'm one of the reasons I'm interdisciplinary is I feel like if I have a scholarly question, the answer to that question isn't just going to be found in the work of historians, right? I'm going to search far and wide for an answer to a particular scholarly question that I had. So when I saw what was happening with the agency, I read as much as I even read a textbook actually on administrative agencies, because I was trying to figure out what is this? What's happening? I was trying to figure out what kind of language and theoretical frameworks to use. So I really appreciate your references to these other scholars, and I'm going to take a look at their work. And one thing I just wanted to add to your comments about why the book is relevant to today, and you talked a lot about the CBP and ICE's monitoring of the protests in Portland and the kidnappings that are taking place, and the violence that CBP and ICE are both using in their enforcement of the immigration laws and the dismantling of asylum law. So I think that if I can just add to that, one of the things that's, I think, important about the book is it tries to emphasize that there are many moments in which the INS and the Border Patrol try to justify or rationalize this violence by making it law, by characterizing it as lawful or legal. And as in the story about the 100-mile zone, right, there's an effort there, right, to completely recharacterize something that the agency had seen as unlawful as something that is just and legal. So another way of seeing this is a lot of the scholarship on the Border Patrol and the INS, and this is very, very important. A lot of the stress right now is on how this immigration agency and the immigration agencies we have now actually break the law, right? Whether it's immigration law or other kinds of law or violate constitutional norms. And they're absolutely correct, right? There are these severe and extensive abuses of power being committed by these agencies. But at the same time, I think what my book is trying to argue, because the INS and the Border Patrol once had so much ability to actually define the law in the first place, we have to see that as another source of the agency's power, right? They're trying to redefine the law to their own advantage, even if it means recharacterizing these illegal and these violent activities as activities that are in turn, right, legal and just. Now, in response to Christina's comments, again, thank you for all the connections to the work of legal scholars. It's given me much food for thought and much to think about. And I think I'll respond to your point about masculinity. I really like this point. It's so important. And there's so much, as all of you may know, there's so much rich scholarship on the culture of the Border Patrol. It's something that Garrett Graff actually writes about in that Politico article that Anna cited. But then you have historians like Kelly Lytle Hernandez and then Alexandra Mina Stern, who I believe is at the University of Michigan. These are two scholars who've written about this culture of masculinity within the Border Patrol, and they explain how that culture drove or shaped the violence. And I think you're very right, Cristina, to observe that it may have even, informed their approach to lawmaking, right? This sense of entitlement that they had to say, well, what we're doing on the border, right, even though others might see it as abusive, we don't see it that way. We see these actions as being legitimate. So that kind of thinking may very well have emerged from this culture of masculinity. Another source I should cite, this is a very recent source. It's a book by Monica Munoz Martinez called The Injustice Never Leaves You. And it focuses, it's a history of the Texas Rangers. It's a remarkable book. And as Kelly Lytle Hernandez points out, many of the Border Patrol officers came from the Texas Rangers, and Martinez intricately details the brutality and frankly the lynchings that were committed by the Texas Rangers in Texas for much of the at least the first half of the 20th century. So when you remember that many of those Rangers then went on to become Border Patrol officers, right? I think that very much goes to your point, Cristina, about how this culture of masculinity and violence would have informed Border Patrol practices. And then as Garrett Graff and others, I think it's Todd Miller at this point who's writing about the Border Patrol a lot, they're both reiterating this point that this culture has never gone away. It's nearly 100 years old that the Border Patrol has really kind of sustained this culture of violence. So hopefully that I've answered, especially any concerns that you might have had about the book.
Thanks, Debbie. Why don't we open up to a bit of crosstalk among the panelists? And I see we've got a couple questions coming in here. Yeah, if any of our fellow panelists would like to pose a question to Debbie or follow up, or Debbie, if you have a question for us, why don't we start right there?
I had a question that I wanted to, oh no, did I just interrupt?
No, go ahead, Christina.
Okay. So I have this, as I was reading the book, this alternating sense between, on the one hand, how powerful the agents were in the field. And that is a very bracing realization, especially, and I like knowing that you self-consciously inverted the normal way we think about the top-down narrative, and instead this is coming up from the bureaucracy. But then there are various points in the book where you talk about, efforts to reform the system were a failure, or the agency is a failure, or they were impotent, and so I left sometimes thinking I wasn't sure how to put it all into a perspective. And maybe the point is that there's no one frame through which to look at it. You're trying to destabilize this. On the one hand, they're feckless, on the other, they're hyper aggressive and powerful, and to suggest it's more about muddling along. But I'm curious how you, if you had that own sense of tension in your mind, and how you would try to resolve it for someone who feels it when reading the book.
So I really like that question, and I thought about that a lot, because historians, we often try to avoid this, what we call a declension narrative, a history of decline. We also try to avoid what we refer to as teleological narratives, or narratives that end up being too presentist, where you can't kind of discern the differences between what's happening today and what's happened in the past. But I felt that based on the evidence I was seeing, I could write a narrative that avoided both of those kinds of organizational structures, which often end up being too simplistic. So every chapter is actually set up in a very specific way. Every chapter is set up to tell a story not only about how the local kind of will drive the national. Every chapter is set up to tell a story about weakness, and how weaknesses within the agency, right, drive what's happening, right? How weaknesses lead the agency officials on the ground to engage in these kind of legal innovations. And sometimes, right, these innovations make the agency stronger. Sometimes they make the agency not as strong. So it's a story. So each chapter it's kind of a story about an agency trying to make things come together, but then it falls apart. And then chapter 2, they try to make things come together, then it falls apart, right? And so every chapter is structured that way. I hope that answers the.
Yeah, no, it definitely has that sense. And then I suppose because I think about it from a contemporary policy point of view, one way of imagining that is that or processing that is that we're just constantly going through that, and yet the result has still, at least over the last several decades, been a secular increase in the size and power of the Border Patrol. But within that, there are lots of different kinds of failures, yes. And maybe there's no way out of it.
Yes.
Oh, I was just going to say, Debbie, very quickly that I appreciate that you telling us about your framing challenges, right? Is this about Western border history, or is it about policy history? I'm like, oh, I'm not the only one having these framing. What is this thing about? So it's good to hear other people have that challenge as well.
Yes. And I think that one of the reasons the challenge is important to me is because, especially as a teacher, I see that students often struggle with policy history, right? And as you were mentioning, certain terms just make your students want to fall asleep. And so I think that's the other reason I try to tell policy history in these interdisciplinary terms. I think policy history and legal history are really important, and they're really interesting to me. I think that's why I told you about my favorite film. But I recognize that a lot of students, they can't deal with the complexity. And so I think that's the other advantage of trying to take a wider lens on these issues.
I can see we are getting a few more questions here and there. So
Yeah.
do you mind if I jump in, Debbie, and ask one of these from the
Yes.
audience? And we can continue the crosstalk. I just want to make sure we're including our participants. One person asked, excellent book, excellent discussion. To what extent does the relationship between worker inclusion and exclusion at the Southwest border depend on a conception of the immigrant workers being temporary versus permanent, with the prospect of citizenship? Any lessons from modern restrictions for immigrant workers?
Okay, so that is a great question. So I think that, this revolving door that's being created on the border with respect to Mexican agricultural labor, I think that's frankly driven less by temporality, as you suggest in your question, and more by just racism. And this is something that immigration historians have long argued, that the perception of Mexican immigrant workers, these very racialized perceptions of Mexican immigrant workers as the so-called ideal workforce, really drove policy formation with respect to these labor importation policies. And this is especially the case because, as all of you know, once these workers were no longer needed, or once the economy went sour, immigration officials expeditiously removed Mexican immigrant workers from the country, right? So that cycle of bringing workers in and then deporting them, again, it's very much driven by these racialized notions of, and what Natalia Molina calls a racial script with respect to Mexican immigration. And then in terms of lessons, I think we need to, especially given what's been happening with the Trump administration, I think there's a real need to rethink our immigration system in a really fundamental way. And I think that with respect to immigrant workers, as well as asylees and refugees, we need to create permanent visa systems, right? And visa systems that stop this cycle of welcome and then deportation. Then also at the same time, ensure that Mexican immigrant workers have protections, certain kinds of labor protections in whatever occupations they're taking in the United States.
Debbie, I just wanted to add a comment, a follow-up question to that question, because I also, that question also made me think of Natalia Molina's work and May Nye's work. And given your ongoing research as it relates to regularization of status, I wonder if you could discuss a little bit about the way in which, for instance, the Act of 1929 that you mentioned earlier, which it both hardens and criminalizes undocumented immigration, while at the same time extending possibilities of regularization of status. But in practice, that regularization is available to European immigrants, many of whom came through Canada, or Canadian immigrants who might not have paid a head tax or had documents prior to their regularization, the regularization of those documents in 1906, and just how that fits within what you had just described, kind of the racialization of some people, particularly Mexican migrants, through the perception of temporary, sorry, I can't think of the word, of being temporary, as opposed to Canadian immigrants or European immigrants being perceived as permanent.
Yeah. Oh, this is reminding me I didn't answer your question about Canada.
Oh, no, don't worry.
But I'll answer that. So, I think this is one of the most exciting developments in immigration, the scholarship on immigration history, you're getting a lot of immigration historians thinking about the Act of March 4, 1929, the Criminalization Act. And I think this is because conventionally, immigration historians mark 29 as kind of an endpoint, or you could call it a high point in the criminalization of undocumented immigrants, especially Mexican immigrants. And Maynai argues that it's that act that renders Mexican immigrants the so-called iconic undocumented immigrant. But a lot of historians are revisiting this and looking at that act in juxtaposition with immigration legalization. As you know, 2 days earlier, March 2nd, Congress passes a legalization law. And so we have accounts now by various scholars. Libby Garland is one. Madalena Marinari talks about the use of that act most recently with respect to Italian immigrants. And so scholars are trying to figure out the relationship between these two provisions, these two statutes. And Brendan, as you observe, the pattern that's currently emerging is one of racialization, whereby, undocumented Mexican immigrants are much more are targeted by the March 4 Act, whereas European immigrants, undocumented European immigrants at the same time are able to take advantage of the legalization, the March 2nd Act. And then I think with respect to the March 4th Act, I find Ingrid Eagly's work really exciting because we don't quite have a sense of the full scale and impact of that act, especially moving into the 1930s. So Ingrid's work might actually unseat my work, and I'm actually fine with that. Because again, she's looking at the what you could call the implementation of that law, the use of that law by federal prosecutors on the ground. And we don't have that story yet. Kelly Lytle has kind of gotten at the implementation story by looking at detention, the detention of undocumented immigrants prosecuted under that law. But then I think we need this other component. And I'm really curious to see if that changes our account of the workings of that law and the criminalization of undocumented Mexican immigrants in this period, and especially in the Depression era, when all administrative agencies are suffering budget cuts. With respect to Canada, I should say that this is another exciting area of research. We're getting more and more work from immigration scholars on immigration law enforcement along the Canadian border. That said, there is already some work. I think, as you know, Brendan, Erica Lee has written a couple journal articles, and there are chapters in her book on the exclusion of Chinese immigrants, particularly by the Canadian government. The Canadian government, despite its reputation today as a kind of immigrant welcoming nation, it was not that by any means in the 19th century with respect to the Chinese. And my own work on immigration legalization, I'm finding the Canadians were also not nice to refugees. Because of Canada's restrictionist orientation toward the Chinese, combined with America's Chinese exclusion law, the Canadian border in some ways very much resembles the US-Mexico border. And then in terms of, with respect to restrictionism, but then in terms of the border crossers, so Ashley Bavery Johnson has a brand new book out on Canada, and I think that book will touch on the border crossers along that line. And I think some of the forces there are similar to the forces on the US-Mexico border, especially in the late 19-teens and 20s. Americans are trying to escape prohibition by going to Canada, and that's a big problem on the Canadian border, as well as the Mexican border. And while I've yet to read Johnson's book, I've read some of her articles. I know a really important variable, dependent variable for her is labor unions. And they very much shaped policymaking on that line. And then it's very interesting because you have, this is actually the second book I was going to do until I decided to work on legalization. That you have labor importation programs on the Canadian border, especially, so you have Canadian workers, temporary Canadian workers, working in the lumber industry in New England, and they're critical to the lumber industry. And what I've been discovering there is that there was a lot of bias in Canada at the time. This is late 19th century, early 20th century, a lot of bias in Canada against French-speaking residents of Montreal. And they were the temporary workers in New England, right? Because they were experiencing, these working class French-speaking workers were experiencing discrimination in Canada. So the border constituted a kind of escape route for them, and they could find employment in New England. So those are some of the studies that are emerging, but in general, we need to know a lot more about immigration law enforcement and policy formation on the Canadian border. I hope based on what I've said here, you can see that there are certain points of convergence as well as points of divergence, but again, we need to know a lot more.
Great. Thank you very much, Debbie. I know we've got a couple more questions from the panel, and we've got some Q&A questions coming in. So why don't I take a Q&A, return to the panel, Q&A, return to the panel. Someone asks, thank you all for your thoughts and works. I would love to hear everyone's thoughts on the state level differences of differences and continuities of immigration enforcement between Southwest states. How do we historicize, for example, California's approach to the border versus Arizona's in the broader context of this story of executive and administrative power?
Yeah, I really like that question. And it's reminding me I didn't answer another one of Brendan's questions.
No, don't worry about it, don't worry.
But it's, so the differences are clear, and especially if you look at the INS records, and the differences are really driven by these mid-level supervisors. So for the El Paso district, it's Grover Wilmoth. For the San Antonio district, it's William Whalen. For the LA district, it's Albert Del Gurcio. And I didn't have the time or resources to research these men, but I think it would make a fascinating study, because as you read the documents, it becomes very clear that these three men have very distinctive visions of border policing. It's striking. Whalen, over the course of the period I look at, and he's covering most of East, he tends to cover San Antonio headed east. His approach tends to be much more hardline. Del Gurcio, surprisingly, given I suspect he is of immigrant descent, he's surprisingly also very, very hardline when it comes to immigration enforcement. And then Wilmoth is more complex. I'm sure these other two, their positions changed over time, but Wilmoth's position changes most clearly. He starts out as someone who's very responsive to the locals. But then by the time Truman takes office, he takes the President's Commission on Migratory Labor as an opportunity. He becomes an entrepreneur, as Anna says, right, to really reshape immigration policy in very restrictionist ways. And so his district, the El Paso district, would have been covering El Paso and points west through Arizona. So I would say it's really the vision of these mid-level managers, these mid-level supervisors, that drives the differences at the state level. And I hope that answers your question.
Does someone, Anna or Christina, would you like to ask an additional question?
I have a question that in some sense follows from the one that was just posed, because it might have a relationship to the way that different figures within the bureaucracy might approach enforcement. One of the kind of favored ideas for bringing the Border Patrol under some kind of control and regulating its abuses short of legal reform is through supervision, and having higher level officials articulate priorities that then get channeled down to the bureaucracy. This was one of the strategies of the Obama administration that eventually led to DACA. But the Border Patrol in particular is thought to be in desperate need of that sort of supervision. But I came away from reading your book like that was a project, feeling like that was a project doomed to fail, because efforts to do that were only successful in a very mixed sense, if at all. And I wonder if this may be being too presentist, but if you would attribute that failure, what would you attribute those kinds of failures of supervision to? Is it because of a lack of resources? Does it have something to do with the under-professionalized culture of bureaucracy, which might be different now than it was in the 30s or the 50s, or some other factor that's specific to time and place that might not be structural, and might make this way of thinking about how to control law enforcement officials viable, as opposed to just completely ahistorical and misguided?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. And I think that there are, on this question, a lot of similarities to today. I think one of the problems that Border Patrol leadership faced is just the quality of the hires. I think the quality and the professionalism of the hires continue to be a problem in the period that I'm covering. And you can see that in the quotes that in the testimony that some of the Border Patrol officers gave in the Dimmick report of 1940. It's clear that the Border Patrol officers continue to have this kind of freewheeling attitude toward immigration law enforcement. I think other factors include just the logistics of what they're doing every day. Unlike the immigration inspectors who are stationed, they're stationary. They're at one place for most of the time, for most of the day, and for most of their career. Border Patrol officers, as we know, are mobile, and they have to cover vast stretches of land. And this means that it's easier for them to escape the gaze of a supervisor. Another interesting thing is they were literally expected to pick up and move, take their families and pick up and move every couple of years. And this is because, once again, their supervisors didn't want them to get too attached to any one place. And especially because we see this happening with the immigration inspectors. They're basically becoming buddies with the locals. And I think this is what's leading the immigration inspectors to lift the immigration restrictions. So the logistics of their work. And then I think another big thing is the Border Patrol, as well as the Immigration Inspection Force, they don't have a set of instructions. They don't have an operations manual. They don't have, no one has their own copy of the immigration laws and rules. And then someone needs to do a study of the Immigration Border Patrol. It's not clear how rigorous that training would have been. So those are some of the factors that would have explained why it would have been hard to achieve centralized control over these agents.
Wonderful, thank you. Another participant asks, as scholars, how do you try to influence current governmental policy? To put a finer point on this question, given the deep history of the INS, what should be done to keep children from being separated from their parents at the border in a Biden administration or a second Trump administration? And I think this could be open to the whole panel as well.
Debbie, you want to take a crack at it first?
Yeah, so this is a great question. It's a difficult question. I think as a historian, it's often difficult to participate in contemporary debates because there are some real clear and often major differences between the policy developments today and policy developments over 50 years ago. So you don't want to, I think it's a mistake to say that, there's a one-to-one correlation between what happened in 54 and what's happening with ICE removals today. But that said, as a historian, if I talk to the media, I say that, this might be useful historical context, or the story of the INS might help us to understand some of the reasons why our nation's immigration agencies developed the way that they did today. For myself, because, and this is a departure for me, because I was so upset by what was going on with the Trump administration, I actually just volunteered my time for an immigration policy center at UC San Diego. It's a policy center run by political scientist Tom Wong. And I basically just asked him, I said, Tom, teach me how to write a policy report. And he did. And so I participated in the writing of a policy report for him. And that was kind of my way of coping with all the feelings I was having about the Trump administration policies today.
All right, let me give it a shot. I tweet into the void. I fact check Trump and his minions in real time. And I don't know how many people I get to with that, but I do get media calls based on tweets, if you can believe it. I do the same things that Debbie does, talk to journalists, provide background. I think one of the things that we forget about as scholars is that we have the expertise to help our students process a lot of what's going on. And so I've set aside a little bit of class time, whatever it is I'm teaching, and I make a link and I try to educate my students about what's going on with immigration and with other areas, because they have experts that they're taking classes with, and it may mean deviating from my syllabus a little bit that day, but it's a teachable moment. I mean, the entire Trump administration is a teachable moment. But the other thing that I think all citizens can do, there's the pandemic going on. There's a lot of chaos from this president. And this is what authoritarians do. They want to throw so much chaos that you throw your hands up and you check out. People have compassion fatigue. There's just too much going on. So if you care about immigration, stay updated on the news and pressure your senators and representatives to do the right thing, whether it be the Biden administration or the Trump administration coming up.
I'll also offer some observations, but first, Anna, someone in the comments says that they learn a lot from your tweets. So you've reached one person. I think one of the roles that academics can play in informing policy debates on matters of urgent concern is to take a step back from some of the polemics and from some of the day-to-day, and to try to put things in context. And I'm not a historian, but I have once, played a graduate student in history and bring history to bear on a lot of my work, because I think that it helps us to understand why we have the system that we do. And that is necessary to figuring out what needs to be dismantled or what needs to be changed and what might be standing in the way of doing those things. And so that historical context, and then also a systemic perspective, looking at a particular set of policies, but putting it in a larger structural or systemic perspective, can also point in the direction of how to change not just the substance, but the structures that might be producing that substance. And in the case of family separation, I think one of the things that demonstrates is both the potency of centralized control, but also the necessity of it. So that was, as we know now from this Inspector General report that came out from the Department of Justice, a high-level decision that seems to have been informed by Trump's own rantings and ravings in the Oval Office. And there were, the Deputy Attorney General was on board with it. And that's political officials sending messages to prosecutors who were squeamish and line officials about what to do. And yet the only way to undo that is to have a strong policy at high levels, including by hopefully the new president-elect himself, that needs to change. But that requires prioritization of different elements of reform. And so that necessitates public pressure and the kinds of things that Anna's also talking about, to elevate issues that will motivate people like a president-elect or an attorney general to change things on the ground. And I think that the family separation policy of everything that this administration has done has led to the most kind of deep-seated revulsion, and almost everyone can understand why that is, tantamount to torture and indecent and all of those things. But that also requires public pressure to continue to remind people that that's the right thing.
Well, we have a few minutes left, so I just wanted to ask the fellow panelists if there's any last minute comment or short question you might want to pose. Please, now's the time.
Let me end with the, I was researching my first book, and I was in the USCIS archives in DC. And I was searching in the archives for a book about the history of the US immigration bureaucracy. After writing grants to go to the archives in DC for a week, within half an hour of being there, I realized that material didn't exist. So the adventures of archival research, you don't really know what's there until you go. So I dropped a footnote in my own book so other people don't go searching for this. So Debbie's book, this is the book that should have been, that I was looking for. So thank you for writing it.
That can do.
I'm really curious, Debbie, since this is the end of this conversation, if you could say one or two things about what you're hoping to learn about legalization and the history of legalization programs, because I think it's a fascinating and exciting topic. And I think we sometimes, at least I sometimes think about it as, there's several moments in time where there were large legalizations, but in fact, there, as your book shows, there are ongoing practices of legalization, some of which are discretionary, some of which were once in the law and no longer exist. And so I'm just interested in what your question is.
Yeah, so I think the interest here is similar to the INS on the line, to give a kind of broad overview of the legal developments in legalization from 1906 to 86. And I think there's a law professor, Richard Boswell. I think his work really kind of lays that out very nicely in a journal article, but I definitely want to expand those and then tell kind of histories of the actual immigrants who were impacted by these legalization measures. So that means that I'm now delving into European history and European immigration history to recount their experiences, and then also the legal mechanisms that were used to adjust the status of these individuals. And at this point, I've only finished one chapter of the book that I'm hoping to publish as an independent article. So it's kind of hard for me to draw any clear conclusions at this point. I have collected all the institutional data for the project. I only have to see a few more archives that will help me get at the social history, but due to COVID, I've been delayed in that. So I'm kind of reluctant to make larger conclusions. Unfortunately, history is not a field where we do things inductively. But I can say that sort of one larger framework or hypothesis that I'm dealing with is this idea put out by another law professor, Alison Brownell-Tires, who, by the way, for those of you who are interested, her next project is on state level alienage laws. And this is going to be really important, right? It's a really hard project to do, but it's going to be really important. But she has a law review article where she writes about this thing called sovereign mercy. And, you know, she rightly shows that in the criminal law context, there are these moments of mercy, right? Where, you know, an individual is granted a pardon or a clemency. And she makes an analogy from there to talk about immigration legalization and how we have to see that also as a form of sovereign mercy. And that these forms of sovereign mercy have actually existed since 1789, since the founding of the nation. So the piece that I'm writing now, the chapter I'm writing now, it's a history of the legalization of a group of refugees known as the White Russians. A special measure was passed on their behalf in 1934. I discovered their case files, their 2,000 case files. I discovered them at the archives a few years ago. And I sampled them, and I'm writing the chapter based on their experience. And again, applying this idea of sovereign mercy and arguing that their legalization marked a moment when, you know, the hardness of our immigration restriction policies, they kind of softened. So I think, you know, I'll see if that concept, that framing still works for the other chapters, and whether I can sort of answer this larger question, you know, how does this idea of sovereign mercy develop, and why does it go away? I think the answer is kind of clear with the Trump administration, right? They've gotten rid of kind of as many forms of discretion as possible. But I'd sort of like to look back in time and see what are these moments in which we granted these kind of discretionary policies, these more kind of humanitarian and merciful policies, and what are the moments in which we retract them. So those are the big.
Look forward to it. Good luck.
Well, I think we are just coming up on the hour, and I think that's a wonderful point to conclude. I just wanted to take the time to say thank you to all of you who attended, to our commentators. Thank you very much for your time, comments, for this wonderful discussion, and to Debbie for sharing your awesome book with us and giving us the chance to have this really, really robust and a lovely discussion. So thank you to all. Have a great rest of the Friday, and we'll see you at the next YCRI event. Have a nice day, everyone.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.